In 1995, 14 wolves were loaded into crates, driven into Yellowstone National Park, and released into a landscape that had not heard a wolf howl in almost 70 years. Nobody in those trucks was thinking about rivers. They were thinking about elk, and maybe about balance, and about putting back a predator that people had wiped out on purpose decades before. What no one expected was that those 14 animals would, over the next 20 years, change where the rivers ran. Not the amount of water, the actual shape of the rivers. The bends, the banks, the pools, the gravel. A handful of wolves walked into a valley, and the valley physically rearranged itself around them. That sounds impossible. A wolf is not an engineer. It does not move soil. It does not plant trees. It does not touch a riverbank. And yet, by the time biologists finished measuring what had happened, the streams of northern Yellowstone were running through different channels than they had before the wolves came back. Something those 14 animals did rippled outward, from the elk to the trees, to the beavers, to the birds, all the way down to the water itself. This is the story of how, and it is also the story of why, parts of it turned out to be more complicated than the version that went viral. Take 1 second to subscribe before we dive in. You will not want to miss where this one ends. To understand what changed, you have to understand what Yellowstone had become without wolves. Wolves were not lost from Yellowstone by accident. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, the United States ran deliberate campaigns to exterminate predators across the American West. Wolves were shot, trapped, and poisoned, inside national parks as well as outside them. By the 1920s, the gray wolf was effectively gone from Yellowstone. The last packs were killed off, and for roughly 70 years, the largest predator in one of the most famous wild places on Earth simply did not exist there. At first, to a lot of people, that looked fine, even better than fine. Without wolves, the elk population in northern Yellowstone grew and grew. Visitors loved it. Elk were everywhere, easy to see, standing in the open, grazing calmly in the valleys along the rivers. A park full of visible wildlife felt like a park that was working. But a valley full of relaxed, hungry elk is not the same thing as a healthy valley. And the damage was happening in a place almost no one was looking, along the streams and rivers. The elk, with no predator to fear, behaved in a very particular way. They spent long stretches of time in the valley bottoms, right along the water, because that is where the youngest, most tender plants grow, and because there was no reason to leave. Nothing was hunting them there. So they stayed, and they browsed. And what they browsed hardest were the young willows, the aspens, and the cottonwoods, the trees that naturally grow along mountain streams. Every time a willow or an aspen sprout tried to grow along the riverbank, elk ate it, year after year after year. The young trees never got a chance to grow tall. Whole stretches of riverbank that should have been thick with willow and aspen became short, cropped, and bare. The valleys looked open and grassy, almost like a lawn, and to a casual eye that seemed pleasant. But the trees that hold a river system together were quietly failing to grow up. Now hold that picture, because this is where the wolves come in. In 1995, and again in 1996, wolves captured in Canada were brought south and released into Yellowstone as part of one of the boldest wildlife restoration efforts ever attempted. The idea was straightforward on paper. Put the missing predator back and let the system rebalance. What actually unfolded was far stranger and more far-reaching than the planners had promised the public. The release itself was tense. The first wolves were not simply let loose to run. They were held for weeks in fenced pens inside the park, so they would not immediately turn and try to walk hundreds of miles back to Canada. Biologists fed them, watched them, and waited. There were fierce arguments before any of it happened. Ranchers near the park feared for their livestock. Some people argued that a place could be wild without its top predator, that the elk and the scenery were enough. When the gates finally opened, no one truly knew whether the wolves would stay, whether they would breed, or whether the whole expensive experiment would collapse within a year. They stayed. They bred. And within a few seasons, there were not 14 wolves in Yellowstone, but dozens, organized into packs with territories, hunting the elk that had spent 70 years with nothing to fear. The wolves did the obvious thing first. They hunted elk. Over the following years, the northern elk herd shrank substantially. Part of that was the wolves, part of it was bears, and part of it was other pressures like hunting outside the park and hard winters. But the wolves were a major new force, and the elk numbers came down. That alone would matter. But the number of elk was not the most interesting part. The most interesting part was fear. With wolves back on the landscape, elk could no longer afford to stand around in the open valley bottoms for days, calmly eating young willow shoots down to the ground. Those valley bottoms, the narrow spaces along streams with steep sides, were exactly the kind of place where a wolf pack could trap an elk. So the elk started to change their behavior. They moved more. They spent less time lingering in the risky spots near water. They stayed alert, and they avoided the places where being caught was most likely. Scientists have a name for this. They call it the ecology of fear. The predator does not only kill prey. The mere presence of the predator changes where the prey dares to go and how long it dares to stay. And that change in behavior can ripple outward through an entire ecosystem, sometimes even more powerfully than the killing itself. In Yellowstone, the ripple went like this. Elk began avoiding the vulnerable stream banks, or at least spending far less time there. For the first time in decades, young willows and aspens and cottonwoods along some of those streams got a chance they had not had in a lifetime. They were not being eaten to the ground the moment they sprouted. So in places, they grew. Willows that had been cropped low for years began to rise, some of them shooting up several feet, becoming real thickets again instead of nibbled stubs. And once the trees came back, other things followed, one after another, in a chain. Willow and aspen thickets along a river are not just scenery, they are habitat. Songbirds that nest in willows had places to nest again. Some of them returned in greater numbers. The recovering trees brought back insects and cover and food, and the riverbanks came alive in a way they had not been for a long time. Then came the beavers, and the beavers are the key to the water. Beavers eat willow. They also build with it. When wolves were gone and the willows were cropped to nothing, there was almost nothing for beavers to eat or build with along many of these streams, and beaver colonies in northern Yellowstone had dwindled to almost none. But as the willows recovered, beavers had material again. Beaver numbers along parts of the northern range began to climb. This part matters more than it sounds, because willow and beaver depend on each other in a loop. Willows need a high water table to thrive, and beaver dams are what keep the water table high. But beavers need willow to eat and to build with in the first place. When both are healthy, they lift each other higher and higher. When both are gone, the absence of one keeps the other from returning. For decades in northern Yellowstone, the loop had been running in reverse, locked in a downward spiral where no willows meant no beavers, and no beavers meant no willows. And a beaver does something no wolf and no elk can do. A beaver builds dams. Beaver dams slow a stream down. They spread water out sideways across the valley floor, instead of letting it rush straight through. They create ponds and wetlands and side channels. They trap sediment. They raise the water table so the ground around the stream stays wetter, which in turn helps even more willows grow, which feeds even more beavers. The stream stops being a single fast cut through bare ground and becomes a complex, braided, wet, living system. This is where the claim comes from, the one that sounds unbelievable. The wolves changed the rivers. The logic runs like this. Wolves changed elk behavior. Changed elk behavior let the willows grow. Growing willows brought back beavers and stabilized the banks. Beaver dams and deep tree roots changed how the water moved, where it eroded and where it settled. Stronger vegetation held the banks together, so the channels narrowed and deepened in places, instead of spreading out into wide, shallow, eroding scars. The physical shape of the streams began to shift. A predator at the top had reached all the way down to the gravel at the bottom of a river. Scientists call this kind of top-to-bottom chain reaction a trophic cascade. One change at the top of the food web cascading down through level after level, reaching things you would never connect to a wolf. And Yellowstone became the most famous example of a trophic cascade on the planet. It was turned into videos, into lectures, into a story told all over the world about how one keystone predator can heal an entire landscape from the top down. And here is where honesty matters, because the real science is more careful than the viral version. The beautiful, simple story, wolves come back and rivers heal, is partly true and partly too neat. Over the years since the wolves returned, ecologists have studied northern Yellowstone intensely, and they have argued about it just as intensely. And the more carefully they looked, the more complicated it got. First, the recovery of the willows and aspens has been patchy, not universal. In some places along some streams, the trees came roaring back once elk pressure dropped. In other places, they did not recover much at all, or recovered only weakly, even though wolves were present. Whether the willows bounce back seems to depend on other things too, like how much water is in the ground, whether beavers are there to keep the water high, and how badly that particular stretch had already been damaged. A stream that had already lost its beavers and dropped its water table could not necessarily heal just because a wolf appeared on the ridge. Second, wolves were never the only thing that changed. Bear numbers, cougar numbers, hunting outside the park, drought, fire, and a warming climate were all shifting at the same time. Pulling out exactly how much of the change was caused by wolves specifically, rather than by everything happening at once, is genuinely hard, and scientists still disagree about the size of the wolf effect. Third, and this is the big one, some researchers argue that the strongest version of the story, that wolves through fear alone reshaped the rivers, has been overstated. They point out that elk did not always behave exactly the way the tidy fear model predicted, and that the landscape is messier than a clean chain of dominoes. They do not say nothing happened. They say the real system has many drivers, and that giving the wolves all the credit turns a complicated ecological story into a fairy tale. So what is actually true? It is true that wolves were restored, and that this was a landmark act of returning a missing native predator. It is true that elk numbers and elk behavior changed after they came back. It is true that in many places willows, aspens, beavers, birds, and stream banks recovered in ways that line up with the wolves being part of the cause. And it is true that Yellowstone became the world-famous symbol of how connected an ecosystem really is, of how the loss of one predator can quietly unravel a whole web, and how bringing it back can begin to knit that web together again. What is not true is that a wolf waved a wand and fixed a river by itself. The rivers changed because dozens of pieces changed together, and the wolf was one powerful piece near the top of that web, not a magician standing outside it. And honestly, that more careful version is not less amazing. It might be more amazing. Because it means the valley is not a simple machine with a single on switch. It is a web so tangled that removing one thread, the wolf, could slowly warp the entire shape of it, and adding that thread back could help, but only in concert with water, and trees, and beavers, and time, and luck. The wolf did not control the river. The wolf was woven into the same web as the river, so tightly that you could not touch one without touching the other. That is the real lesson of Yellowstone, and it is bigger than wolves. For most of history, people treated predators as simply dangerous, as pests to be removed, as animals whose only role was to kill things we cared about. Yellowstone without wolves was the experiment, 70 years long, that showed what happens when you pull a top predator out. The valley did not become a peaceful paradise of happy elk. It slowly came apart at the edges, along the water, where almost no one was watching. And putting the wolf back did not instantly repair everything, but it began to reveal just how many things had been quietly leaning on that one animal all along. Today, wolves live and hunt in Yellowstone again. Packs move across the northern range. In many valleys, the willows are taller than they have been in generations. Beavers are back at work on some streams, and songbirds nest along banks that were bare for decades. In other spots, the recovery is slow or stalled, and scientists keep measuring, keep arguing, keep learning. The valley is not finished. It never was. A living system does not have a final version. It has a direction. 14 wolves went into Yellowstone in 1995. They were meant to bring back a missing predator. What they really did was remind us that in a wild landscape, nothing stands alone. Pull one thread, and things you never suspected begin to move. Put it back, and the whole web feels it, all the way down to the shape of the water running through the ground. If you enjoy true stories of the wild pulled back from the edge, stories most people never hear the full version of, then like this video and subscribe. In the next one, we will follow another species the world had already written off. Take care of yourself, and stay curious.